Good evening, and welcome. I'm glad you're here, whether you're listening to rest, to reflect, or simply to understand the Bible more clearly. This time is yours. There's nothing you need to do right now, but listen, let the day settle, and allow your attention to rest on a story that has shaped civilizations, beliefs, and history for thousands of years. Tonight, we are not exploring individual verses, isolated books, or symbolic fragments. We are following one continuous story. From the opening words of Genesis to the final vision of Revelation, the Bible presents a single narrative with a beginning, a conflict, a long unfolding struggle, and an ending that brings resolution. Many people know parts of this story, but few have followed it from start to finish as one connected account. The Bible begins with order, purpose, and creation. It moves quickly into fracture, disobedience, and separation. It follows humanity's repeated failure to live within the boundaries given to them, and God's repeated commitment to restore what was broken. Across generations, covenants are made and broken, laws are given, kingdoms rise and fall, warnings are ignored, and consequences follow. This pattern is not random. It drives the story forward. As we move through this narrative, we will see why the law was given, why kings failed, why prophets warned, and why restoration was promised long before it arrived. We'll reach the point where the story turns, where expectation meets fulfillment, and where the direction of history changes. And finally, we will follow the story to its conclusion, where judgment, renewal, and resolution are brought together. This is not a sermon, and it is not a theological debate. This is a biblical story, told as it unfolds, step by step, cause by cause, consequence by consequence. We will focus on what happens, why it matters, and how each part leads to the next. Nothing here relies on mystery for effect. The story is compelling on its own. Before we begin, if you appreciate calm, clear storytelling that respects your time and intelligence, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps this project reach others who are looking for long, factual narratives like this one. And in the comments, I'd like to ask you something specific. Are you listening to this to fall asleep or to learn? And where are you watching from right now? Now, let's begin at the beginning. The biblical story begins with intention rather than chaos. Genesis opens by presenting a universe brought into existence through deliberate action. Light is separated from darkness. Land is divided from sea. Time is structured into days and cycles. Creation unfolds in sequence, not randomly, and each stage builds upon the previous one. This order matters because it establishes the framework for everything that follows. The world is not portrayed as accidental, but is purposeful and governed. Humanity enters this ordered world as part of that purpose. Man and woman are created with responsibility, not autonomy. They are given dominion over the earth, but not ownership. The distinction is critical. Dominion implies stewardship within limits. The first humans are placed in a defined environment, the garden, with clear boundaries. They are permitted to enjoy its abundance, but they are also given a command that establishes moral structure. One boundary exists, and it is explicit. The command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not presented as arbitrary. It introduces choice into an otherwise ordered system. Obedience becomes possible because disobedience is possible. The story does not suggest ignorance. The command is spoken clearly. The consequences explained in advance. The foundation of the biblical conflict is set here. Freedom within limits. The disruption of this order comes through deception rather than force. The serpent does not deny God's command outright. It reframes Italiano. Doubt is introduced about God's intent rather than his existence. The temptation centers on autonomy, the idea that humans can determine good and evil for themselves rather than receiving that definition. The decision to eat from the tree represents a rejection of boundary, not a lack of understanding. The result is immediate and structural. Awareness changes. shame appears. Relationship fractures. The humans hide, not because God is absent, but because trust has been broken. The story emphasizes consequence rather than punishment. The ordered system no longer functions as intended. Work becomes difficult. Relationship becomes strained. Mortality enters the human experience. Separation replaces harmony. God's response establishes a pattern that will repeat throughout the Bible. Judgment is delivered, but it is paired with preservation. The humans are expelled from the garden, but they are not destroyed. Boundaries are enforced, but life continues. Even in this moment, the story introduces the idea that restoration will be necessary and costly. A future conflict is hinted at, one that will unfold over generations. This opening act establishes the core problem the rest of the Bible addresses. Humanity is created within order, given freedom, and chooses autonomy. The consequence is separation, not annihilation. The world continues, but it does so fractured. Every covenant, law, warning, and promise that follows responds to this initial breach. From this point forward, the story is no longer about creation alone. It becomes about repair. The question is not whether humanity will fail again, but how God will respond when it does. The pattern of command, choice, consequence, and mercy is now in motion. As this act closes, the foundation is set. Order has been established and broken. Humanity remains alive, but separated. The story must now move outward, showing how this fracture spreads beyond individuals into families, societies, and eventually the entire world. The next act will show how quickly the consequences of this first choice multiply. And after the expulsion from the garden, the biblical story moves quickly from individual disobedience to collective consequence. The fracture introduced in Eden does not remain contained within the first humans. It spreads outward into family life, work, and social order. The text makes this progression clear by focusing immediately on the next generation. The problem is no longer theoretical. It becomes visible in behavior. The story of Cain and Abel presents the first recorded act of human violence. Both brothers bring offerings, but the narrative emphasizes motive rather than material. Cain's offering is rejected, not because of form alone, but because of disposition. When confronted, Cain is warned explicitly that wrongdoing is a choice and that it can be resisted. The warning is clear and direct. Cain understands it, ignores Italiano. The result is murder. This moment marks a critical escalation. Disobedience moves from boundary violation to bloodshed. The response follows the pattern already established. Cain is hudged, but not destroyed. He is removed from proximity, marked for protection, and sent Hawaii. Again, separation replaces harmony, but life continues. The biblical story consistently refuses to end humanity at its worst moment. It preserves life while acknowledging consequence. As generations pass, the narrative compresses time to show pattern rather than detail. Human population increases, but so does corruption. Violence becomes common. Moral boundaries weaken. The text describes a world where intention itself is distorted, where wrongdoing is no longer exceptional, but normal. This description is not symbolic. It is diagnostic. It explains why intervention becomes necessary. The flood narrative is presented as a response to this condition. It is not framed as impulsive destruction, but as a reset aimed at preserving the possibility of order. Noah is introduced not as perfect, but as responsive. He listens, he acts. The flood removes widespread corruption, but it does not eliminate the underlying problem. Human nature remains unchanged. This becomes clear immediately after the flood. Order is reestablished. A covenant is made. Boundaries are yet failure returns quickly. Noah himself falters. His sons respond differently, revealing that moral fracture still exists within the renewed world. The story reinforces a central point. Catastrophe can remove environment, but it cannot repair disposition. The narrative then shifts focus again, this time toward collective ambition. Humanity gathers, unites, and builds. The Tower of Babel is not condemned for cooperation itself, but for motive. The goal is self-definition without reference to God. Once again, autonomy is the driving force. Humanity seeks permanence and identity on its own terms. The response is division. Language is confused. Unity dissolves. People scatter. This scattering is not random punishment. It prevents centralized corruption from repeating indefinitely. Separation becomes a tool of restraint. The world fragments into nations, cultures, and identities. The single human family becomes many peoples. By the end of this phase, the condition of humanity is clear. Given freedom, humans repeatedly choose autonomy over obedience. Given unity, they pursue self. Given second chances, they repeat the same pattern. The biblical story has now fully established the problem it intends to address. Corruption is widespread. Separation is structural. Restoration will require something more than reset. As this part closes, the story stands at a turning point. Humanity has been scattered, restrained, and preserved, but not repaired. The question now shifts. If the problem cannot be solved globally, can it be addressed locally? The next part will introduce a decisive change in strategy. As the narrative narrows its focus to one family through whom restoration will be pursued, with humanity scattered and unified order prevented, the biblical narrative shifts direction. Instead of addressing the entire world at once, the story narrows. This narrowing is intentional. It marks a strategic change in how restoration will be pursued. Rather than restarting creation again, the narrative introduces a chosen line through which the larger problem will be confronted. Abram enters the story without prior explanation. He is not presented as exceptional by merit or background. He lives among people shaped by the same fractured condition described earlier. The significance of Abram lies not in who he is, but in what is promised through him. God's call to Abram introduces a covenant that directly responds to the dispersion at Babel. Where humanity was scattered, a people will now be formed. The promise given to Abram has three components: land, descendants, and purpose. He is told that his family will become a nation, that they will inhabit a defined territory, and that through them, all nations will be blessed. This final element is crucial. The covenant is not exclusive for its own sake. It is instrumental. The story narrows in order to expand later. Abram's response establishes a new pattern. Unlike previous figures, he acts on trust rather than environment. He leaves his land without knowing the destination. This obedience does not eliminate failure. Abram will struggle, doubt, and act out of fear later. The narrative does not hide this. What matters is direction. The covenant progresses despite human inconsistency. As Abram's family grows, the story emphasizes delay. Promises are made, but fulfillment is postponed. Years pass without an heir. This delay tests the covenant's credibility. Human solutions intervene. Abram fathers a child through Hagar, attempting to resolve divine promise through human means. The result is conflict rather than clarity. The narrative reinforces the same lesson. Autonomy complicates rather than completes. The covenant is reaffirmed and renamed. Abram becomes Abram. His wife Sarai becomes Sarah. Identity shifts reflect role rather than achievement. The promised son, Isaac, arrives not as a reward for effort, but as fulfillment beyond capacity. The story emphasizes timing. Restoration moves according to divine schedule, not human urgency. The narrative then follows this family line through Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's sons. Conflict continues. Favoritism divides. Deception recurs. Brothers betray brothers, yet the covenant persists through failure. This persistence is not approval of wrongdoing. It is commitment to outcome. The story is consistent. God works through flawed participants to move the narrative forward. The focus eventually lands on Joseph, whose story illustrates consequence layered with intention. Betrayed and sold into slavery, Joseph's path leads him to power in Egypt. His rise preserves the family during famine. What appears as tragedy becomes mechanism. Preservation, not comfort, is the priority. The chosen family survives by relocating into a foreign land. This relocation matters. The family grows into a people within Egypt, but they do so as outsiders. What begins as refuge becomes captivity. The narrowing focus has succeeded in creating a people, but the problem of separation has not been resolved. It has taken new form. The story has moved from global corruption to national formation, but the underlying tension remains. As this part closes, the covenant is active, the people are multiplying, and the stage is set for the next development. The family has become a nation in waiting, bound by promise but shaped by oppression. The question now becomes how this people will be formed into a distinct community with law, structure, and identity. The next part will show how liberation and instruction enter the story together. As the descendants of Abraham multiplied in Egypt, their status shifted from protected guests to controlled labor. What began as refuge during famine hardened into oppression over generations. A new pharaoh arose who did not remember Joseph, and fear replaced gratitude. The growing population of Israelites was perceived as a threat rather than a blessing. Control became policy. Forced labor became routine. Identity was suppressed through pressure rather than erased through violence. This period establishes a recurring biblical theme. Suffering alone does not produce obedience or clarity. The Israelites cried out under oppression, not because they had become righteous, but because the burden became unbearable. Their appeal was heard, and the narrative introduces Moses as the central figure through whom liberation would come. Moses himself embodies tension. Raised in Pharaoh's household yet born an Israelite, he exists between identities. His early attempt to intervene through violence fails, reinforcing that deliverance will not come through impulsive force. The call of Moses reframes the story again. God reveals his name and declares intent to act, not only to free the people, but to demonstrate authority over the systems that enslave them. The plagues that follow are not random punishments. Each one confronts an element of Egyptian power, economy, or religious confidence. Liberation is achieved through confrontation, not negotiation. The message is consistent. Authority cannot be transferred quietly when oppression is entrenched. The Exodus itself marks a defining moment. The people leave Egypt collectively, not as individuals. Their identity shifts from slaves to a nation in motion, yet freedom introduces instability. Immediately after deliverance, fear replaces trust. The same people who witnessed released out provision. The narrative is explicit. Removal from bondage does not equal internal change. Egypt is left physically, but its influence remains. This tension reaches a peak at Sinai. The people receive law alongside freedom. The law is not given as a means of rescue, but as a framework for identity. It defines boundaries, responsibility, and relationship. The covenant established here is conditional. Blessing follows obedience. Consequence follows rebellion. The structure is clear. The people agree to it openly. Yet even as the covenant is being delivered, violation occurs. The golden calf episode exposes the core problem again. In the absence of visible authority, the people recreate familiar patterns. They demand representation they can control. The law is not misunderstood. It is ignored. The response is judgment, followed by intercession and continued presence. Again, separation is enforced without abandonment. The wilderness period that follows reinforces the lesson. Provision is given daily, direction is constant, yet trust fluctuates. Complaints recur. The people long for what they were freed from. The narrative emphasizes repetition to make a point. External rescue does not resolve internal inclination. Law clarifies expectation, but it does not transform desire. By the end of this phase, Israel stands as a free people with a defined identity, yet still marked by the same patterns seen since Eden. Given command, they resist. Given provision, they doubt. Given boundary, they test it. The problem introduced at the beginning has not been removed. It has been contained, managed, and revealed more clearly. As this part closes, the people are positioned to enter the land promised to Abraham. They are free, instructed, and accompanied. Yet the narrative makes clear that possession of land will not resolve the deeper issue. The next part will show how fear and disobedience delay fulfillment, and how separation continues to shape the story even after liberation. As the Israelites approached the land promised to Abraham, the story reached a decisive moment. The journey from Egypt had established freedom and law, but possession of the land would test trust in a new way. 12 spies were sent to survey the territory. Their task was practical, not symbolic. They were to assess conditions, not to determine whether the promise was true. That question had already been settled. The report revealed two realities at once. The land was fertile and abundant, confirming the promise. At the same time, it was occupied by fortified cities and strong inhabitants. 10 of the spies focused on the obstacles. Their conclusion was not that the promise was false, but that obedience was too costly. Fear reframed reality. The people accepted this framing immediately. Memory of deliverance faded in the presence of risk. This reaction exposed the unresolved issue. The people trusted God to rescue them from Egypt, but not to sustain them through conquest. Obedience required forward movement without full control. Fear redirected decision. The people chose safety over promise, even when safety meant returning to the condition they had been freed from. The narrative emphasizes how quickly confidence collapses when circumstances threaten comfort. The consequence was delay rather than destruction. The generation that refused to enter the land would not see it. The promise was not canceled, but postponed. Once again, separation served as both judgment and preservation. The people wandered until the generation shaped by slavery passed away. The next generation would inherit, not because they were better, but because the opportunity had been preserved. This period reinforces the central pattern of the biblical story. Freedom does not eliminate fear. Law does not guarantee obedience. Promise does not remove responsibility. The people are sustained daily, guided constantly, and warned repeatedly. Yet they continue to resist full trust. The fracture introduced in Eden remains active. By the time Israel finally prepares to enter the land under new leadership, the story has clarified its core tension. Humanity, even when chosen, rescued, and instructed, struggles to live within trust and obedience. The problem is not lack of evidence. It is resistance to dependence. As this master act closes, the foundation of the biblical narrative is firmly established. Creation introduced order. Disobedience introduced fracture. History revealed repetition. The story has narrowed from all humanity to one people, but the underlying issue remains unresolved. Law has defined the problem. Deliverance has exposed it. Delay has confirmed it. The next act will show how settlement in the land, the rise of kings, and the pursuit of stability introduce new forms of the same struggle. Power will replace fear as the dominant challenge, and the question of obedience will take on national scale. With the death of the wilderness generation, Israel finally entered the land that had been promised centuries earlier. The transition from wandering to settlement marked a new phase in the biblical story. The people were no longer a nation in motion, dependent on daily provision in the desert. They were now a people rooted in territory, responsible for maintaining order, justice, and covenant faithfulness within a permanent home. This shift introduced opportunity, but it also exposed new forms of vulnerability. The conquest of the land was partial rather than total. Some regions were secured, others were not. This incomplete settlement mattered. It created ongoing proximity between Israel and surrounding peoples with different customs, political structures, and religious practices. The command had been clear. Exclusive devotion was required to preserve identity. The reality, however, was coexistence. What was tolerated for convenience became a source of influence over time. The period that followed is described as an era without centralized leadership. Authority was local, tribal, and temporary. When external pressure arose, leaders emerged. When stability returned, leadership dissolved. This cycle defined the era. The people repeatedly abandoned covenant practices, adopted surrounding customs, and experienced consequence. When oppression became severe, they cried out. Deliverance followed. Peace returned. The pattern then repeated. This repetition is not presented as coincidence. It reveals a deeper issue. Without sustained leadership and accountability, obedience deteriorated quickly. The law existed, but it was not enforced consistently. Memory of past deliverance faded within a generation. The narrative emphasizes how easily identity dissolves without structure. The leaders who arose during this time functioned as responders rather than reformers. They addressed immediate threats, but rarely established lasting change. Their authority was situational. Once the crisis ended, the people returned to previous patterns. Stability proved temporary. Faithfulness proved fragile. This period culminated in moral and social fragmentation. The text describes a society where communal standards collapsed and individual judgment replaced shared responsibility. The phrase, "everyone did what was right in their own eyes," summarizes the condition. Autonomy, the same impulse introduced at the beginning of the story, now defined national behavior. The demand for a king emerged from this context. The people did not ask for leadership to deepen obedience. They asked for leadership to provide security and uniformity. They wanted to be like surrounding nations. This request marked a critical transition. Authority would now be centralized. Stability would be pursued through structure rather than trust. The request for a king was framed as rejection of divine rule, but it was also an acknowledgement of failure. The people recognized that the existing system was not working. The question was not whether they needed leadership, but what kind. The shift from judges to kings would amplify both obedience and disobedience. As this part closes, the story stands at a crossroads. The people are settled, but unstable. They possess the land, but not unity. The law exists, but enforcement is inconsistent. The stage is set for monarchy, not as an ideal solution, but as a response to persistent failure. The next part will follow the rise of kingship, showing how power initially brings order, but also introduces new risks that will shape the rest of the biblical narrative. The establishment of monarchy in Israel begins with tension rather than triumph. The people's request for a king is granted, but not without warning. They are told clearly what centralized power will demand: taxation, labor, military service, and submission. The narrative emphasizes that kingship will not remove burden. It will redistribute it. The people accept this cost, valuing visible authority over uncertain dependence. Saul becomes Israel's first king, chosen for appearance, strength, and immediate appeal. His rise brings short-term stability. He unifies the tribes militarily and confronts external threats. Yet his reign exposes the limits of authority without obedience. Saul's failures are not strategic, but spiritual. He acts impulsively, disregards instruction, and substitutes partial obedience for full compliance. His kingship demonstrates that power can enforce order, but it cannot compensate for a disregard of command. The transition from Saul to David marks a shift in emphasis. David is not presented as flawless, but as responsive, His defining characteristic is not perfection, but orientation. When confronted, he acknowledges failure rather than justifying it. This distinction matters. David consolidates the kingdom, establishes Jerusalem as capital, and brings the ark into the city. National identity becomes more unified, and worship gains a central place. Yet David's reign also reveals that proximity to power increases consequence. His personal failures carry national impact. Violence, betrayal, and unrest follow his decisions. Still, the covenant made with David introduces a new element into the story. His lineage is promised continuity. Stability is now tied not only to obedience, but to a specific line through which future hope will come. Solomon inherits a unified and peaceful kingdom. His reign represents the peak of Israel's political power. Under Solomon, the temple is built, administration expands, and international influence grows. Wisdom governs policy. Peace replaces conflict. From the outside, the search for stability appears complete. The system works. Internally, however, the risks of monarchy mature. Accumulation increases. Boundaries soften. Alliances multiply. The law's warnings about kings begin to materialize. Solomon's reign shows how stability achieved through power introduces new vulnerabilities. The same authority that builds order can normalize compromise. By the end of Solomon's reign, the kingdom is unified in name but strained in substance. The pursuit of stability has succeeded politically, but at a cost to devotion. The monarchy has delivered what the people asked for, but not what the covenant required. The pattern remains consistent. Human solutions address surface problems, while leaving deeper issues unresolved. As this part closes, kingship stands revealed as both instrument and risk. It can unify and protect, but it can also magnify failure. The question now shifts from whether stability can be achieved to whether it can be sustained without undermining covenant identity. The next part will show how this tension resolves in division, as the kingdom built for unity fractures under the weight of accumulated compromise. The stability achieved under Solomon did not end with his reign. It fractured immediately after his death. This fracture was not sudden or unexpected within the biblical narrative. It was the delayed consequence of accumulated decisions, tolerated compromises, and unaddressed strain. What appeared unified from the outside had already been weakened internally. The transition of power simply exposed what had been forming for decades. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, inherited a kingdom marked by prosperity and resentment. The systems that had supported Solomon's wealth required labor and taxation on a national scale. While these burdens were managed under Solomon's authority, they were never removed. When Rehoboam ascended the throne, the people requested relief rather than revolution. Their appeal was specific and limited. They asked for reduced pressure, not independence. Rehoboam's response revealed how far leadership had shifted from discernment to dominance. Rejecting experienced counsel, he chose to assert authority through increased burden. This decision transformed dissatisfaction into rejection. The tribes withdrew allegiance, not because they opposed kingship itself, but because they no longer recognized it as serving their well-being. The kingdom divided along existing fault lines that Solomon's reign had deepened. This division fulfilled earlier warnings. The law had cautioned against accumulation and excess. The prophets had spoken of consequence. The fracture was not random. It followed the pattern established since Eden. When boundaries are ignored and power replaces obedience, separation follows. Unity dissolves, not through force, but through withdrawal of trust. The northern kingdom, under Jeroboam, immediately faced a legitimacy crisis. Without Jerusalem or the temple, maintaining allegiance required alternative structures. Jeroboam's solution prioritized control over fidelity. New worship centers were established to prevent the people from returning south. This decision institutionalized compromise. Political necessity reshaped religious practice. In Judah, continuity appeared stronger. Jerusalem remained the capital. The temple still stood, yet the southern kingdom was not immune to decline. The same compromises that weakened the north existed in tolerated form in the south. Stability depended increasingly on reform cycles, rather than sustained faithfulness. Kings alternated between obedience and accommodation. The divided kingdom marked a turning point in the biblical story. From this point forward, unity would be remembered rather than experienced. The promise given to Abraham now moved through fractured history. The covenant remained active, but its expression was divided. The story shifted from expansion to preservation. As this part closes, the search for stability through power is complete. Kingship has delivered order, and also division. The pattern has proven consistent. Without exclusive devotion, even divinely permitted structures failed to endure. The kingdom stands divided, and the story moves toward confrontation rather than consolidation. The next part will show how prophets rise to confront both kingdoms, clarifying that division has not ended responsibility, and that warning now replaces expansion as the dominant movement of the narrative. With the kingdom divided, the biblical narrative introduces a new dominant voice: the prophets. Their rise is not coincidental. Kingship has reached its limit as a solution to Israel's instability. Authority, structure, and power remain, but they no longer correct direction. The prophets emerge to address what kings cannot: the covenantal failure beneath political order. Prophets are not primarily predictors of the future. They are covenant enforcers. Their message is consistent across generations and across both kingdoms. Obedience has been replaced by ritual. Power has replaced justice. Worship has been reshaped to serve political need rather than covenant faithfulness. The prophets speak directly into this distortion, confronting kings, priests, and people alike. In the northern kingdom, prophetic warnings are frequent and severe. Leaders rule through fear, manipulation, and violence. Worship is fully entangled with state control. The prophets expose this arrangement as unsustainable. They announce consequence, not as threat, but as certainty. The covenant has conditions, and those conditions have been violated repeatedly. The message is not complicated. It is ignored. In Judah, the prophetic message is similar, though the context differs. The presence of the temple creates false confidence. Ritual continues, but justice collapses. The prophets challenge the assumption that sacred space guarantees protection. They emphasize that obedience, not proximity, defines covenant faithfulness. The temple becomes a symbol of misplaced trust rather than security. The response to prophetic warning is largely resistance. Kings tolerate prophets only when they support policy. When they challenge it, they are silenced, ignored, or persecuted. This reaction reveals the depth of the problem. Power has become self-preserving. Correction is treated as threat. The system no longer reforms itself. The prophets also introduce a forward-looking element. Alongside judgment, they speak of restoration. This restoration, however, is not framed as political revival. It is described as internal transformation. leadership that aligns with obedience rather than dominance. These promises indicate that the existing structures cannot produce lasting change. Something new will be required. As warnings accumulate, the political situation deteriorates. External powers rise. Internal cohesion weakens further. The divided kingdoms lack the unity and devotion necessary to resist pressure. The prophets do not prevent collapse, they explain it. Their role is diagnostic, not corrective. By the end of this phase, the search for stability through land, law, and kingship has reached exhaustion. Each element was necessary. None proved sufficient. The story has demonstrated that external structure cannot resolve internal fracture. The problem identified in Eden remains active, now embedded in national systems. As this master act closes, the narrative is prepared for its next major movement. Judgment will soon move from warning to execution. Exile will replace possession. The people will lose what they sought to secure through power. Yet even in this collapse, the prophets insist the story is not ending. It is narrowing again. The next act will follow this narrowing through exile and promise, showing how loss becomes preparation and how the expectation of restoration begins to take clearer form. And the exile of Israel and Judah marks a decisive transition in the biblical story. What had been announced repeatedly by the prophets now takes historical form. This moment is not portrayed as sudden disaster, but as the result of accumulated failure. The warnings were clear. The opportunity to respond existed. The exile arrives, not as surprise, but as consequence. The northern kingdom of Israel falls first. Assyria rises as a dominant power, expanding aggressively across the region. Israel, weakened by internal instability and persistent idolatry, cannot withstand the pressure. Cities are captured. Leadership collapses. The population is deported and scattered among foreign territories. This scattering echoes earlier dispersions in the story, reinforcing a recurring pattern. Separation follows disobedience. The biblical narrative is explicit about cause. The fall of Israel is attributed to persistent covenant violation rather than military disadvantage alone. The people abandoned exclusive devotion, adopted surrounding practices, and ignored prophetic warning. Exile becomes the enforcement of what had already been broken. The land, once given as inheritance, is lost because the conditions of that inheritance were rejected. Judah's fall follows later and unfolds more gradually. Unlike Israel, Judah experiences periods of reform that delay collapse. Kings attempt restoration. Idolatry is confronted. Worship is centralized again. Yet these reforms do not persist. Each generation repeats the same cycle. External obedience replaces internal change. When reform fades, vulnerability returns. Babylon emerges as the power Judah cannot resist. Political alliances fail. Military strength proves insufficient. Jerusalem is besieged. The temple is destroyed. The city that symbolized permanence is dismantled. This destruction carries profound weight. The loss is not only territorial, it is theological. The place where God's presence was believed to dwell now lies in ruins. The exile confronts Israel with a question that could no longer be avoided. Had God abandoned his people, or had the people abandoned the covenant? The prophets answer clearly. Exile is not rejection. It is discipline. The covenant remains active, even as possession is removed. The story insists that loss does not equal abandonment. In exile, the people face identity without land, king, or temple. The structures that once defined faith are gone. What remains is memory, law, and promise. This stripping away exposes what was essential and what was assumed. Without political power or sacred space, faith must exist without reinforcement. As this part closes, exile stands as both end and beginning. Everything that had provided stability has been removed. The people are scattered, humbled, and displaced. Yet the story does not conclude here. The same prophets who announced judgment now speak of return. Restoration is promised, but it will not replicate the past. The next part will show how hope emerges within loss, and how expectation shifts from political recovery to deeper renewal. Life in exile forced a fundamental shift in how Israel understood its relationship with God. With no land, no king, and no temple, the people could no longer rely on national structures to sustain identity. What had once been reinforced by ritual, geography, and political order now depended on memory, teaching, and personal commitment. Exile removed every external support and exposed the core of faith. The biblical narrative presents this period not as silence, but as reflection. Prophets continued to speak, reframing loss as correction rather than defeat. They reminded the people that exile had been warned of in advance, and that it did not nullify the covenant. Instead, it revealed its seriousness. Obedience had always been the condition, not location. The land had been a gift, not a guarantee. During this time, the law took on renewed importance. Without temple sacrifices, obedience became centered on instruction, practice, and transmission. Families preserved identity by teaching, remembering, and distinguishing themselves from surrounding cultures. This period marks the development of practices that would sustain the people long after exile ended. Faith adapted, not by changing its core, but by shedding dependence on power. The prophets also introduced a deeper promise. Restoration would not simply return Israel to its former political status. It would involve internal change. Language of a new heart, renewed spirit, and redefined covenant appears repeatedly. The problem identified since Eden could not be solved by land or kingship alone. Exile prepared the people to understand this limitation. Political realities still mattered. Empires rose and fell. Babylon gave way to Persia. Under Persian rule, opportunities for return emerged. Yet even as return became possible, the narrative emphasizes caution. Restoration would be partial. The people would return to the land, but not to independence. The temple would be rebuilt, but not with former glory. The Davidic throne would remain vacant. This incomplete restoration is intentional within the story. It prevents the people from mistaking return for resolution. The same conditions that led to exile still exist. The narrative refuses to reset history as if failure had not occurred. Instead, it moves forward carrying consequence and promise together. As communities returned to Jerusalem, they faced resistance, scarcity, and disappointment. Expectations of immediate renewal were unmet. The rebuilt temple lacked the splendor of Solomon's structure. Political authority remained foreign. The prophets addressed this disappointment directly, insisting that fulfillment had not been canceled, only delayed. By the end of this phase, Israel existed again in the land, but not as a sovereign nation. Identity had shifted. Faith no longer depended on power. Expectation no longer rested on kingship alone. The story had narrowed again, preparing for a different kind of intervention. As this part closes, exile has reshaped understanding. Loss has clarified limits. Return has exposed incompletion. The stage is now set for a long period of waiting, where promise remains active but fulfillment remains unseen. The next part will follow this waiting, showing how hope is preserved across centuries of silence and anticipation. The return from exile marked a physical movement back to the land, but it did not restore what had been lost in full. Under Persian authority, groups of exiles traveled back to Jerusalem in stages. They rebuilt homes, restored basic infrastructure, and eventually reconstructed the temple. These efforts were significant, yet they unfolded under limitation. The people returned as subjects of an empire, not as an independent nation. Authority remained external. The rebuilding of the temple became the central symbol of this partial restoration. When its foundations were laid, reactions were divided. Some celebrated, while others wept. Those who remembered Solomon's temple recognized immediately that this structure did not match the former glory. The narrative preserves this moment to emphasize discontinuity. Return did not erase history. Consequence remained visible. Leadership during this period shifted from kings to administrators, priests, and teachers. Figures like Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah focused on rebuilding identity rather than expanding territory. Walls were restored to provide security. The law was read publicly to re-establish covenant awareness. These actions addressed survival and order, not dominance. The people learned again that their existence depended on obedience rather than power. Yet even in this restored setting, familiar problems resurfaced. Intermarriage with surrounding peoples raised concerns about identity and devotion. Economic inequality appeared quickly. Religious observance became formalized, sometimes disconnected from justice. The prophets continued to speak, warning that ritual without obedience repeated earlier failures. The story insists on continuity. Return alone does not produce change. This period introduces a prolonged tension. The people possess the land, but not autonomy. They worship in the temple, but without the ark or divine manifestation described earlier. They follow the law, but struggle with consistency. The Davidic promise remains unfulfilled. The absence of a king becomes conspicuous. Expectation grows, but clarity does not. Centuries pass within this unresolved state. Empires change hands. Persia gives way to Greece. Greece fragments. Rome rises. Throughout these transitions, Israel remains subject to external rule. Revolts occur and are suppressed. Political solutions fail repeatedly. The hope for restoration shifts increasingly toward future intervention rather than immediate reform. This long waiting period shapes expectation. The prophet's promises of renewal, justice, and a restored kingdom are remembered, studied, and debated. Interpretations vary, but the sense of incompletion is shared. The story has not ended. The solution has not arrived. History continues without resolution. By the end of this phase, the biblical narrative has created a sustained sense of anticipation. The original problem introduced in Eden remains. Law has clarified it. Kingship has magnified it. Exile has exposed it. Return has confirmed that it cannot be resolved through repetition of earlier systems. As this part closes, the people stand in their land yet remain under foreign rule, faithful yet waiting, restored yet incomplete. The narrative has narrowed again, preparing for a decisive development that will not repeat the past. The next part will show how expectation solidifies and how the story positions itself for a turning point that redefines fulfillment. By the end of the return period, the biblical story settles into a prolonged state of expectation. The people are no longer in exile, yet they are not restored in the way the promises seem to suggest. The land is occupied, but sovereignty is absent. Worship continues, but without the fullness once described. The covenant is remembered, but its resolution remains incomplete. This condition is not temporary within the narrative. It lasts for centuries. During this time, the people live under successive empires. Persian rule gives way to Greek dominance. Greek control fractures, and Roman authority eventually replaces it. Each transition reshapes daily life, but none resolves the deeper question the story has raised since the beginning. Who will address the fracture between humanity and God that law, kingship, and exile have only exposed? The prophet's words become central during this waiting. Their messages are preserved, read, and interpreted. They speak of a future restoration that will not mirror the past. A renewed covenant. A faithful leader. Justice that reaches beyond ritual. These promises are not framed as optional hope, but as necessary fulfillment. The existing systems have reached their limit. This waiting period also produces tension. Different expectations emerge. Some anticipate political liberation through force. Others expect moral reform through stricter obedience. Still others wait for divine intervention that will redefine leadership entirely. These differing hopes reveal uncertainty, but also shared dissatisfaction. Everyone agrees that the story is unfinished. The narrative deliberately slows here. Generations pass without recorded revelation comparable to earlier periods. This silence is not absence. It is preparation. The weight of history accumulates. The failures of previous solutions are remembered. The longing for resolution becomes sharper precisely because repetition has proven ineffective. The temple stands, but it no longer guarantees security. The law is taught, but it does not produce transformation on its own. Identity survives, but fulfillment does not arrive. The biblical story insists that the problem identified in Eden still governs the human condition. External correction has failed. Internal change is required. By the close of this master act, the story has reached a critical threshold. Everything that could be tried has been tried. Creation, covenant, law, kingship, exile, and return have all played their role. None have resolved the central fracture. The narrative has narrowed repeatedly, stripping away false solutions and clarifying expectation. This is not a pause before repetition. It is a pause before interruption. The next act will not introduce another judge, king, or reform movement. It will introduce a turning point that reframes the entire story. What has been promised, delayed, and anticipated will enter history in a form that does not resemble previous solutions. As this act closes, the story stands poised. The people wait. The promises remain. The question of restoration is no longer whether it will happen, but how. The next act will mark the moment where the biblical narrative moves from preparation to fulfillment, shifting from anticipation to arrival. The appearance of Jesus in the biblical narrative does not interrupt the story. It enters it at a moment shaped by long expectation. Centuries of waiting, interpretation, and unresolved promise form the background against which Jesus appears. The political context is tense. Roman authority governs the land. Religious leadership is divided between preservation of tradition and accommodation to power. The people are familiar with prophecy, but uncertain about fulfillment. Jesus is introduced without political position, military force, or institutional authority. His origin challenges expectation immediately. He is born outside centers of power, raised away from influence, and enters public life without credentials recognized by existing leadership. This absence of conventional authority is deliberate within the narrative. The solution to the problem introduced in Eden does not arrive through repetition of earlier systems. Jesus' message is consistent and focused. He announces the arrival of the kingdom of God, not as distant hope, but as present reality. This announcement reframes expectation. The kingdom is not defined by borders, armies, or political independence. It is defined by alignment with God's will. This definition confronts both religious and political assumptions. Restoration will not mirror past structures. His actions reinforce this message. He heals, teaches, and confronts without consolidating power. His authority is demonstrated through response rather than enforcement. People follow because they recognize coherence between message and action. This coherence contrasts sharply with systems built on position rather than alignment. Jesus' teaching frequently references the law and prophets. He does not dismiss them. Obedience is internal rather than performative. Devotion is measured by intent rather than ritual alone. This emphasis addresses the central problem revealed throughout the narrative. External structure has proven insufficient. Transformation must reach motivation. Conflict arises quickly. Religious leaders challenge Jesus, not for lack of knowledge, but for perceived threat to authority. His interpretation undermines systems built on control and separation. Political leaders view him cautiously, recognizing potential unrest without clear allegiance. Jesus occupies a position that cannot be absorbed easily into existing categories. The narrative emphasizes choice in response to Jesus. Some follow, some resist, some observe without commitment. This diversity mirrors earlier patterns in the story. Humanity is again confronted with a boundary. Alignment is possible. Rejection is possible. Neutrality proves temporary. Jesus' role within the story becomes increasingly clear. He does not simply teach better obedience. A embodies Italiano. Where Israel failed, he remains aligned. Where kings compromised, he resists. Where law clarified but could not transform, he models fulfillment. His life becomes the lens through which the entire narrative is reinterpreted. This phase establishes Jesus not as an isolated figure, but as the turning point the story has been moving toward. The promises preserved through exile and return converge here. The solution does not arrive through force or reform, but through presence and obedience lived fully. As this part closes, expectation meets reality. The story that began with creation, fracture, and repeated failure now stands at its center. The question is no longer whether restoration is possible, but how it will be accomplished. The next part will show how opposition intensifies as this turning point becomes unavoidable. As Jesus' public activity expanded, confrontation became unavoidable. His message did not exist in isolation. It interacted directly with every structure that had defined Israel's religious and political life. What distinguished this confrontation was not aggression, but exposure. Jesus did not organize rebellion, yet his presence revealed the limits and contradictions of existing systems simply by operating within them without conforming to them. Religious leaders were the first to respond with sustained opposition. Their authority depended on interpretation, tradition, and boundary enforcement. Jesus challenged none of these in principle, but he challenged their application. He confronted hypocrisy, selective obedience, and the use of religious law as a mechanism of control rather than restoration. This confrontation was precise. It targeted behavior, not heritage. Knowledge was not questioned. Alignment was the law, which had been central to Israel's identity since Sinai, was not dismissed by Jesus. Instead, it was intensified. External compliance was declared insufficient. Motive mattered. Intent mattered. Internal disposition mattered. This shift destabilized a system that relied on visible conformity. When obedience is internal, it cannot be measured or enforced in the same way. Authority based on external markers Luta's leverage. Political tension also increased. Roman authorities tolerated religious debate, but they were alert to movements that could destabilize order. Jesus did not openly oppose Rome, but his language about kingship and authority introduced ambiguity. Crowds followed him. Expectations rose. The possibility of unrest grew. Political leaders monitored him not because he sought power, but because power often follows influence. Jesus' response to these pressures remained consistent. He avoided alignment with revolutionary movements and refused to position himself as a political alternative. When pressed to define his authority within existing frameworks, he redirected the conversation toward purpose rather than position. His refusal to be categorized frustrated those who sought to either control or eliminate him. This period of confrontation clarified the stakes. Jesus was not another prophet calling for reform within the system. He was not a king attempting to replace the system. He represented a resolution that rendered existing solutions insufficient. Law, kingship, ritual, and power were shown to point beyond themselves. This implication threatened every group invested in maintaining those structures as final. The response hardened. Accusations shifted from misunderstanding to blasphemy. The issue was no longer disagreement over interpretation. It was perceived threat to authority and identity. The same pattern seen throughout the biblical story repeated. When confronted with alignment that exposes compromise, systems choose preservation over correction. At the same time, Jesus' closest followers struggled to understand the trajectory of events. Their expectations, shaped by centuries of waiting, leaned toward visible victory. They anticipated restoration through triumph. Jesus spoke instead of suffering, rejection, and death. This disconnect created confusion. Fulfillment was unfolding, but not according to anticipated form. The narrative emphasizes inevitability. Opposition grows not because Jesus escalates, but because his presence leaves no neutral ground. Acceptance requires reorientation. Rejection preserves control. The path toward confrontation narrows as dialogue gives way to decision. By the end of this phase, lines are clearly drawn. Religious leaders seek grounds for removal. Political authorities prepare to intervene if unrest escalates. The crowd's expectations fluctuate between admiration and disappointment. The story moves toward its most critical moment, where resolution will come not through avoidance, but through culmination. As this part closes, the turning point deepens. Every system has been addressed and found insufficient. The solution the story has been preparing for now faces elimination by the very structures it exposes. The next part will follow this movement toward confrontation, showing how rejection becomes the mechanism through which resolution is achieved. As opposition solidified, the narrative moves from debate to determination. The religious leadership no longer seeks clarification or correction. The goal becomes removal. Jesus' continued presence threatens established authority, not because he gathers armies, but because he reframes legitimacy itself. Alignment with God is no longer mediated through institution or lineage. It is embodied in obedience. This shift cannot coexist with systems built on control. The events leading to Jesus' arrest unfold deliberately. Betrayal comes from within his closest circle, not from distant enemies. This detail matters within the story. The fracture introduced in Eden has always operated closest to trust. Knowledge does not prevent failure. Proximity does not guarantee alignment. Judas' decision reflects the recurring theme of choosing outcome over obedience, control over trust. The arrest itself is restrained. Jesus does not resist. His followers attempt defense and are rebuked. This moment clarifies intent. The resolution of the story will not come through force. Jesus submits to the process unfolding around him, not because it is just, but because it serves a purpose beyond immediate outcome. Authority is demonstrated through restraint rather than dominance. The trials that follow expose the failure of both religious and political systems. Charges are inconsistent. Testimonies conflict. Procedures are bent to reach a predetermined conclusion. The narrative does not present these trials as lawful judgments, but as demonstrations of how systems preserve themselves when threatened. Justice becomes secondary to stability. Political authority enters reluctantly. Roman leadership finds no clear basis for execution, yet yields under pressure. Order is prioritized over truth. Responsibility is shifted. This decision reflects a broader pattern in the story. When confronted with moral clarity that threatens peace, power chooses containment. Jesus' execution is presented without dramatization. It is described as fact, not spectacle. He is crucified publicly, outside the city, as a criminal. This outcome appears to confirm failure. The promised restoration seems to end in defeat. Expectations collapse. The disciples scatter. Hope dissolves. From every visible measure, the story appears to reverse rather than resolve. Yet the narrative frames this moment differently. Jesus' death is not portrayed as interruption, but as fulfillment. References to covenant, sacrifice, and obedience converge here, where earlier systems could clarify but not repair. This act addresses the fracture directly. Obedience is completed without compromise. Trust is maintained without exception. The significance of this moment lies not in the mechanics of execution, but in its meaning within the story's trajectory. The problem introduced in Eden was not ignorance, but rebellion. Restoration, therefore, requires more than instruction. It requires alignment carried to its limit. Jesus' death represents obedience maintained where humanity repeatedly failed. The burial that follows reinforces finality. The body is placed in a tomb. Guards are posted. The story pauses. Silence returns, echoing earlier periods of waiting. From the perspective of those who follow Jesus, the narrative is ended. There is no expectation of reversal. Death is treated as conclusion. This pause is essential. It removes ambiguity. If restoration is to occur, it cannot be explained as recovery, escape, or illusion. The story must either end here or transform in a way no previous system has achieved. As this part closes, the turning point reaches its lowest visible point. The solution the narrative has been moving toward has been eliminated by the systems it exposed. The question now is unavoidable. If restoration is still possible, it must occur beyond the reach of law, power, and death itself. The next part will address that question directly, as the story moves from apparent conclusion to definitive resolution. The narrative does not remain in silence. What follows the burial of Jesus is not presented as metaphor or spiritual reinterpretation, but as reported event. On the third day, the tomb is found empty. This discovery is not framed as expectation fulfilled, but as confusion introduced. Those who find the tomb do not arrive anticipating resurrection. They arrive expecting to complete burial customs. The absence of the body creates uncertainty, not immediate belief. The accounts emphasize verification rather than impression. The tomb is inspected. The grave clothes are noted. Multiple witnesses encounter the risen Jesus over a defined period of time. These appearances occur in different locations and circumstances. They include conversation, instruction, and shared meals. The narrative insists on continuity. The one who was crucified is the one who appears. Resurrection is not replacement, it is restoration beyond death. This moment reframes everything that came before it. Death, which had marked the limit of consequence since Eden, is no longer final. The fracture introduced at the beginning of the story is addressed at its deepest point. Resurrection is not portrayed as reversal of suffering, but as confirmation that obedience carried through death produces resolution that law and power could not achieve. Jesus' post-resurrection instruction focuses on mission rather than consolidation. He does not reclaim political authority or re-establish national structures. He commissions witnesses. The kingdom he announced earlier continues to expand through testimony rather than force. Authority is transferred, not centralized. The story moves outward rather than inward. The ascension that follows reinforces this transition. Jesus' departure is not abandonment. It marks a shift in how presence is understood. The narrative emphasizes continuity of purpose rather than physical proximity. What began with one family, then one nation, then one individual, now expands again beyond geographic boundary. The resurrection stands as the hinge of the entire biblical story. Creation introduced order. Disobedience fractured it. Law clarified the problem. Kingship attempted to manage it. Exile exposed it. Return failed to resolve it. Jesus' life embodied alignment. His death completed obedience. Resurrection confirmed resolution. This act closes the first half of the biblical story's conclusion. The problem has been addressed decisively, but its implications have not yet unfolded fully. Restoration has been inaugurated, not completed. The story now shifts from fulfillment achieved to fulfillment extended. As this master act closes, the turning point is complete. The narrative no longer asks how restoration will come. It asks how it will spread, how it will be received, and how history will move toward its final resolution. The next act will follow this expansion, tracing the formation of the early church and the long tension between fulfillment already achieved and fulfillment not yet complete. The period following the resurrection marks a shift from singular focus to collective continuation. The story no longer centers on one individual moving through history, but on a growing community shaped by what has already occurred. The earliest followers of Jesus do not immediately form institutions or political structures. They begin as witnesses, sharing what they claim to have seen and heard. Their message is consistent. Jesus lived, was executed, and rose from the dead. This proclamation becomes the foundation of the movement. The narrative emphasizes that this expansion begins in a controlled environment. Jerusalem, the city of execution, becomes the first center of testimony. This choice matters. The message does not spread first to distant regions where verification would be impossible. It is proclaimed where the events occurred and where opposition is strongest. This detail reinforces the claim's confidence. The witnesses speak publicly, not privately. The formation of the early church is organic rather than strategic. Believers gather regularly, share resources, and devote themselves to teaching and prayer. Leadership emerges in response to need rather than ambition. Roles are assigned to maintain unity and care. This structure reflects continuity with Jesus' emphasis on service rather than dominance. Authority remains relational and functional. Opposition arises quickly. Religious authorities respond to the movement as a threat to stability. The message challenges existing interpretations of law and undermines control over religious life. Arrests follow. Warnings are issued, yet suppression proves ineffective. The narrative emphasizes growth under pressure rather than decline. Resistance becomes catalyst rather than deterrent. This expansion is not limited to one cultural context. A decisive moment occurs when the movement extends beyond Jewish boundaries. Gentiles are included without first adopting national identity. This inclusion fulfills earlier promises that restoration would reach all nations. It also creates tension within the community. Tradition and expansion collide. Resolution comes not through force, but through reaffirmation of purpose. The conversion of former opponents highlights the story's internal consistency. Persecution does not eliminate the movement. It disperses it. Witnesses carry the message outward as they flee danger. What appears as setback becomes mechanism. The same pattern seen throughout the biblical narrative repeats. Constraint produces spread. By the end of this phase, the church exists across regions, cultures, and languages. It does not possess political power. It does not control territory. Yet it continues to grow. The narrative presents this growth as evidence that restoration is operating through transformation rather than domination. As this part closes, the movement has expanded beyond its origin. The message has traveled farther than previous systems ever reached. The question now shifts again. How will this growing community survive sustained opposition, internal disagreement, and delayed fulfillment? The next part will follow these tensions as the church navigates endurance rather than expansion alone. As the early Christian movement expanded, it encountered sustained resistance from multiple directions. Opposition did not come from a single source or ideology. It emerged from religious authorities threatened by loss of control, from local communities unsettled by social change, and from imperial systems wary of any allegiance that transcended political loyalty. This layered resistance shaped how the church developed its identity and practices. Persecution was not uniform, but it was persistent. In some regions, believers faced social exclusion and economic pressure. In others, imprisonment and execution occurred. These responses were not reactions to military threat or rebellion. They were reactions to allegiance. The claim that Jesus was Lord conflicted with existing structures of authority. This conflict was unavoidable. The movement could not be absorbed quietly into the surrounding order. The apostles addressed these pressures through instruction rather than retaliation. Letters circulated among the communities, providing guidance on conduct, unity, and endurance. These writings emphasized consistency of life, mutual support, and trust in the promised outcome. The focus remained forward-looking. Suffering was not interpreted as failure, but as participation in a larger process that had already been modeled by Jesus. Internal challenges also emerged. Disagreements over leadership, cultural practice, and doctrine threatened cohesion. The narrative does not hide these tensions. They are addressed directly through dialogue, correction, and reaffirmation of shared purpose. The resolution of conflict within the community becomes a defining characteristic. Unity is maintained not through uniformity, but through alignment around the core message. As time passed, the expectation of immediate completion adjusted. Early believers anticipated swift resolution of history. When fulfillment did not arrive quickly, instruction emphasized perseverance. Faithfulness was reframed as long-term commitment rather than short-term anticipation. This shift allowed the movement to survive delay without dissolving into disappointment. Despite pressure, the church continued to grow. Its expansion relied on personal networks rather than institutional reach. Communities formed in homes. Leadership remained decentralized. This structure limited vulnerability to targeted suppression. When leaders were removed, others continued the work. The movement's resilience lay in its distribution rather than concentration. By the close of this phase, the church existed within a state of tension. It was established but vulnerable, growing but opposed, unified yet diverse. The narrative emphasizes endurance as the dominant theme. Restoration had begun, but its completion remained future. The church lived in the overlap between what had been achieved and what was still awaited. As this part closes, the story prepares to address a new challenge. Expansion has succeeded. Survival has been tested. The question now becomes how this movement understands itself within the broader sweep of history. The next part will explore how expectation of the end shapes behavior, identity, and hope under prolonged waiting. As the early Christian communities matured, a defining tension became unavoidable. The central event of the story had already occurred, yet its final outcome had not. Restoration had been inaugurated, but history continued. This condition required a recalibration of expectation. The movement had to learn how to live faithfully in a world that had not yet changed in visible or permanent ways. Teachings during this period emphasized vigilance rather than withdrawal. Believers were instructed to remain engaged in daily life while maintaining distinct priorities. Work, family, and civic responsibility were not abandoned. Instead, allegiance was reordered. Ultimate loyalty belonged to God, while temporary structures were navigated with restraint. This approach prevented both assimilation and isolation. The expectation of future completion shaped ethical instruction. Behavior was framed not as compliance with law, but as alignment with a coming reality. Patience, endurance, and self-control were emphasized because the outcome was assured, though delayed. The narrative presents this posture as stabilizing. Hope anchored behavior when circumstance provided little reinforcement. False assurances emerged alongside delay. Some claimed that completion had already occurred. Others exploited expectation for influence or gain. These distortions were addressed directly. The community was warned against speculation and manipulation. Clarity replaced urgency. Faithfulness replaced prediction. The story insisted that waiting did not require guessing. This period also saw the refinement of leadership and teaching. As eyewitnesses aged and died, preservation of testimony became essential. Accounts were recorded. Instruction was formalized. This transition did not replace witness. It preserved it. Memory became mission. The story ensured continuity beyond a single generation. Suffering continued, but its interpretation matured. It was no longer seen only as immediate participation in conflict, but as ongoing testimony. Endurance itself became witness. Communities that remained consistent under pressure demonstrated the credibility of their hope. The narrative emphasizes this quiet persistence as evidence of transformation. By the end of this phase, the church had adjusted to prolonged waiting without abandoning expectation. It had learned to live responsibly within history while anticipating its resolution. This balance prevented collapse under delay and fanaticism under urgency. Restoration was understood as certain, not immediate. As this part closes, the movement stands resilient. It has survived opposition, internal tension, and deferred fulfillment. The story now shifts toward its final perspective. Having shown how restoration begins and spreads, the narrative will now turn to how it concludes. The next part will address the ultimate horizon of the biblical story, where expectation gives way to completion. As the first generations of believers passed, the Christian movement entered a phase defined less by rapid expansion and more by sustained endurance. The initial witnesses were gone, but the testimony they preserved remained active. Communities now existed across the Roman world, connected by shared belief rather than centralized authority. This dispersion was not weakness, it was protection. No single removal could end what had become widely distributed. Persecution continued intermittently, sometimes local, sometimes empire-wide. These pressures tested commitment rather than knowledge. Belief was no longer new or novel. It was inherited, practiced, and defended through consistency of life. The narrative emphasizes that an endurance itself became a form of witness. The movement survived not because it avoided suffering, but because it interpreted suffering within a larger story that promised resolution. At the same time, institutional structure began to form. Leadership roles were clarified. Teaching was preserved and transmitted. This development was not presented as departure from original intent, but as adaptation to longevity. A movement intended to persist across generations required stability without domination. Authority remained accountable to teaching rather than personality. The church's relationship with power remained cautious. Alliances with political authority were limited and often resisted. The movement had learned from earlier stages of the biblical story. Power could stabilize, but it could also distort. Allegiance remained primary. Identity was preserved through boundary rather than dominance. By the close of this phase, the church existed fully within history, yet oriented beyond it. Its message addressed present conduct and future hope simultaneously. Restoration was understood as underway, but not complete. This tension defined daily life. Faithfulness meant persistence rather than progress measured by control or expansion. As this master act closes, the narrative prepares for its final movement. The question of how history will end moves from abstraction to articulation. The story that began with creation and fracture has moved through covenant, law, kingship, exile, return, fulfillment, and expansion. Only one element remains unresolved: final restoration. The next act will bring the story to its conclusion. It will not describe a new system or another phase of trial. It will present the end toward which everything has been moving. Judgment, renewal, and completion will be addressed directly. The biblical narrative will close, not with ambiguity, but with clarity. The final movement of the biblical narrative shifts attention from historical development to ultimate resolution. What began with creation and fracture now turns toward completion. The language of the New Testament's final writings does not introduce a new theme. It gathers and concludes every thread that has already been woven. The end is not disconnected from the beginning. It answers. Italiano. The story's conclusion is framed as revelation rather than speculation. The future is not presented as human projection or philosophical possibility. It is disclosed as outcome. This disclosure addresses the unresolved tension that has existed since Eden. History has moved forward, but restoration has remained incomplete. The end of the age resolves this condition directly. Judgment becomes central in this phase. It is not portrayed as arbitrary punishment or emotional reaction. It is presented as moral accounting. Choices made within history matter because history is moving toward evaluation. The same pattern seen throughout the story remains consistent. Responsibility accompanies freedom. Delay does not eliminate consequence. This judgment applies universally. It does not target a single nation or group. The narrowing that occurred earlier now expands fully. What began with one family and one people now includes all humanity. The scope of restoration matches the scope of fracture. The story completes its outward movement. The imagery used to describe this phase is symbolic, but its meaning is concrete. Evil is confronted and removed. Corruption does not coexist with restoration. The narrative makes this clear. Completion requires separation between what aligns with God's will and what resists it. This separation is final rather than provisional. The role of Jesus remains central. He is presented not only as the turning point of history, but as its culmination. Authority is no longer contested or hidden. What was revealed through obedience and resurrection is now established openly. The kingdom announced earlier is fully realized. For the faithful, this conclusion is described as vindication rather than escape. Endurance is acknowledged. Waiting is resolved. The tension between fulfillment begun and fulfillment delayed, and restoration becomes complete rather than anticipated. For the story as a whole, this phase resolves the problem introduced at the beginning. Autonomy that fractured creation is answered by alignment that restores it. Death, which entered as consequence, is removed as condition. Separation gives way to reconciliation. As this part closes, the biblical narrative stands on the threshold of its final declaration. The end is no longer approaching. It is being described. The next part will examine what is removed, what remains, and how judgment clears the way for renewal. As the biblical narrative moves deeper into its conclusion, judgment is described not as interruption, but as necessity. Throughout the story, corruption has been tolerated temporarily to allow for response, repentance, and restoration. In the final phase, this tolerance ends. Completion requires clarity. What cannot be healed is removed. What cannot align is separated. This action does not contradict mercy. It fulfills justice. Judgment is presented as comprehensive and impartial. No position, status, or history exempts anyone from evaluation. The same standard applies universally. The narrative emphasizes accountability because freedom has always been real. Choices carried consequence from the beginning, even when consequence was delayed. The final judgment brings resolution to that delay. The imagery used to describe this process communicates permanence rather than intensity. Evil is not restrained temporarily. It is ended. Deception, violence, exploitation, and rebellion are not negotiated with or managed. They are removed from participation in the restored order. The story insists that restoration cannot coexist with corruption. One must give way. This removal also addresses the persistence of injustice throughout history. Wrongs left unresolved, victims unheard, and accountability avoided or not ignored. Judgment restores moral balance. It affirms that endurance was not meaningless, and that suffering was not unnoticed. This affirmation completes the long arc of patience that defined earlier phases of the story. Importantly, judgment is not portrayed as chaos. It is ordered and purposeful. Authority is exercised openly rather than contested. The fragmentation that defined earlier eras no longer applies. The systems that once mediated power and influence are rendered obsolete. No institution or empire survives this transition. Only alignment matters. This phase clarifies the meaning of delay. History was not extended because consequence was uncertain. It was extended because response was possible. The end confirms that opportunity has concluded. What remains reflects what was chosen. As this part closes, the story stands at the point where removal has cleared the way for renewal. What disrupted creation has been addressed fully. The next part will describe what replaces corruption, how restoration is experienced, and what the renewed order looks like once separation is complete. With corruption removed, the biblical narrative turns decisively toward renewal. This renewal is not presented as repair of a damaged system, but as replacement of what could no longer sustain alignment. The story emphasizes continuity of purpose rather than continuity of structure. What is restored is not the world as it once functioned, but the world as it was intended to function from the beginning. The imagery used to describe this renewed state draws directly from the opening chapters of Genesis. Creation, once fractured by disobedience, is now described as reordered permanently. There is no indication of provisional stability or conditional peace. The cycle of command, failure, consequence, and delay that defined earlier history does not resume. The narrative makes clear that renewal is final rather than temporary. Central to this renewal is a restored relationship. Separation, which entered the story immediately after the first act of disobedience, is eliminated. The presence of God, once mediated through sacred space, law, and leadership, is now direct and uninterrupted. The shift completes the narrowing and expansion pattern that defined the entire narrative. What began with one place and one people now includes all who remain aligned. The removal of death stands as one of the most significant elements of this renewal. Death entered the story as consequence and limit. It shaped fear, urgency, and loss across every generation. In the final state, death is no longer described as transition or passage. It is described as ended. The narrative treats this not as metaphor, but as condition. Mortality no longer defines existence. Alongside death, suffering is also removed. Pain, mourning, and injustice are not managed or mitigated. They are absent. This absence does not trivialize earlier suffering. It validates it. The story insists that what was endured mattered precisely because it did not continue indefinitely. Restoration affirms that endurance had purpose. Identity in this renewed state is clarified rather than erased. Individuals are not absorbed into uniformity. Distinction remains, but without division. Diversity no longer produces conflict because competition and scarcity are absent. The narrative presents harmony as outcome of alignment rather than enforcement. The renewed order also resolves the question of authority. Authority no longer requires mediation, defense, or assertion. It exists openly and uncontested. The conflicts that characterized history between nations, ideologies, and powers no longer apply. What once required warning and judgment now operates through shared alignment. This phase of the story also completes the role of Jesus. The one who embodied obedience within history now presides over restoration beyond history. The authority that was concealed during his life and contested during the expansion of the church is now fully visible. The kingdom announced earlier is no longer partial or internal. It is comprehensive and permanent. Importantly, the narrative emphasizes permanence. There is no suggestion of future rebellion, decline, or repetition of earlier patterns. The story closes the door on the cycle that defined history. Restoration is not vulnerable to fracture because the condition that enabled fracture has been removed. As this part closes, the biblical narrative approaches its final articulation. Judgment has cleared corruption. Renewal has established permanence. The story that began with creation now stands completed. Only one element remains to be addressed explicitly: the meaning of this completion for the entire story that preceded it. The final part will bring that meaning into focus, closing the narrative not with ambiguity, but with resolution. The final articulation of the biblical narrative leaves no thread unresolved. What is presented is not an open-ended future or symbolic suggestion, but a completed account of where history leads. The story that began with intentional creation and fractured through human autonomy now concludes with intentional restoration. This completion is not merely chronological. It is thematic. Every element introduced earlier finds its resolution here. The renewed creation is described as both familiar and transformed. It retains continuity with the original intent of Genesis while removing the conditions that allowed corruption to persist. The world is no longer defined by scarcity, fear, or decay. The systems that once governed survival, competition, and dominance are no longer necessary. The narrative emphasizes that this state does not require enforcement. Alignment has replaced resistance. The role of humanity within this restored order is clarified. Dominion, once distorted into control and exploitation, is returned to its original meaning. Responsibility exists without conflict. Relationship exists without suspicion. The tension between freedom and obedience that defined earlier history no longer produces fracture. Choice remains, but its misuse no longer threatens the integrity of the whole. The story also resolves the long-standing problem of trust. Throughout history, trust was repeatedly broken between humanity and God, between individuals, between nations. In the final state, trust is no longer fragile. The conditions that incentivized betrayal and self-preservation have been removed. Security is no longer maintained through power, but through permanence. Memory of past suffering is not erased, but it no longer defines identity. The narrative does not suggest amnesia, it suggests perspective. What was endured is understood within a completed story. Loss is contextualized rather than denied. This perspective affirms that history mattered because it moved toward resolution, not because it continued indefinitely. The final vision also addresses the question of purpose. Throughout the biblical narrative, purpose was often obscured by delay, opposition, and failure. In completion, purpose becomes clear. Creation was not an experiment. Restoration was not contingency. The story presents completion as fulfillment of original intent rather than correction of error. Importantly, the conclusion does not introduce new instruction, warning, or command. Instruction belonged to history. Warning belonged to delay. Command belonged to formation. In completion, these functions are no longer required. Alignment has become condition rather than goal. Obedience no longer resists. It expresses it. The presence of God, once mediated through covenant, law, temple, and person, is now direct and constant. This presence does not overwhelm or erase humanity. It completes it. Separation, which entered the story immediately after creation, is fully undone. The relationship intended at the beginning is now permanent. With this, the biblical narrative ends where it began, but not as repetition. Creation is restored, not restarted. History is fulfilled, not reversed. The cycle of fracture and repair is closed. There is no suggestion of further progression, decline, or interruption. The story has reached its intended conclusion. As this master act closes, the Bible's final message is not escape from reality, but completion of it. The story does not deny suffering. It answers Italiano. It does not ignore failure. It resolves Italiano. It does not abandon creation. It restores it fully. The narrative that began with the words in the beginning now ends with clarity rather than question. What was broken has been restored. What was promised has been fulfilled. What was anticipated has arrived. History, as the Bible tells it, is complete. When the biblical story is viewed from beginning to end, its meaning does not depend on interpretation layered afterward. It emerges from the sequence itself. Creation, fracture, covenant, law, kingship, exile, return, fulfillment, expansion, judgment, and restoration are not disconnected themes. They form a single progression that explains why the world is the way it is, and why it does not remain that way. The Bible presents history as purposeful rather than cyclical. Events do not repeat endlessly without resolution. Patterns recur, but they move toward an outcome. Human failure is consistent, but it is not final. The story insists that what appears unresolved at one stage is clarified at the next. This structure separates the biblical narrative from myth or moral instruction alone. It is not primarily a collection of lessons. It is an account of movement toward completion. At the center of this movement is the problem introduced early and never ignored. Humanity chooses autonomy over alignment. This choice produces separation, distortion, and death. Every major development in the story responds to this condition. Law defines it. Kingship attempts to manage it. Exile exposes it. Return fails to resolve it. These stages are not failures of plan. They are necessary demonstrations of limitation. Each one shows what cannot heal the fracture. Jesus' role within the story confirms this progression. He does not enter as an alternative teacher among many. He enters as the point where the story changes direction. His life demonstrates alignment where humanity consistently failed. His death addresses consequence rather than avoiding it. His resurrection confirms that restoration reaches beyond death itself. This sequence explains why earlier solutions could not succeed fully. They were never designed to. The expansion of the church reinforces this meaning. Restoration does not spread through conquest or domination. It spreads through witness and endurance. The story rejects the idea that lasting change can be imposed externally. Transformation occurs through alignment freely chosen, sustained across time, and tested under pressure. Delay does not negate fulfillment. It reveals commitment. The final judgment and restoration clarify why history mattered at all. Choices were real because they were meaningful. Suffering mattered because it was not permanent. Endurance mattered because it was not forgotten. The narrative insists that justice delayed is not justice denied. Resolution arrivis, not as reaction, but as fulfillment of intent established at the beginning. When read as a whole, the Bible explains both persistence and hope. It explains why humanity repeatedly fails to sustain peace, justice, and alignment through power or knowledge alone. It also explains why failure does not have the final word. The story neither flatters humanity nor abandons it. It presents humanity as responsible, limited, and redeemable. This first part of the final act establishes a critical conclusion. The Bible is not primarily about moral improvement or national identity. It is about restoration of relationship and order at every level of existence. Individual behavior, communal life, and historical direction are all addressed because the fracture affected all of them. As this part closes, one truth stands out clearly. The biblical story makes sense only when read forward. Taken in fragments, it appears inconsistent or unresolved. Taken as a whole, it reveals coherence. The ending does not contradict the beginning. It completes it. The final part will close the narrative by addressing what this completed story leaves behind for those who hear it now, and how the Bible positions the listener within a story that has reached its conclusion but still demands response. With the story now complete, the biblical narrative leaves the listener with clarity rather than ambiguity. It does not end by inviting speculation about alternate outcomes or unfinished arcs. It ends by establishing that history, as the Bible tells it, has moved from intention to fulfillment. What remains is not uncertainty about direction, but decision about alignment. The story has reached its conclusion. The response belongs to those who hear it. One of the most consistent features of the biblical narrative is that it never removes responsibility. From the first command in Eden to the final declaration of restoration, choice remains real. Humanity is never portrayed as trapped by fate or rescued without consent. Alignment is offered, not imposed. Even at the end of the story, restoration is described as comprehensive, but not coercive. What remains reflects what was chosen. This framing explains why the Bible never presents its conclusion as mere comfort. It is reassurance paired with accountability. The resolution of history confirms that endurance mattered, obedience mattered, and response mattered. The delay that characterized so much of the story was not absence of control. It was space for decision. History unfolds long enough for alignment to be chosen freely, rather than forced by immediate. The completed narrative also explains why earlier stages were necessary. The law clarified expectation, kingship tested power. Exile exposed dependence. Return revealed incompletion. Jesus embodied fulfillment. The church extended witness. Judgment resolved corruption. Restoration completed purpose. None of these stages are redundant. Each one answers a question raised by the previous stage. Together, they form a coherent explanation rather than a collection of doctrines. For the listener now, the story positions humanity after fulfillment but before experience of final restoration. The outcome is described. The direction is settled. What remains is participation through alignment. The Bible does not place the listener at the center of history. It places the listener within it, after the turning point and before the visible completion. This position explains why faithfulness, endurance, and consistency still matter, even though the story's conclusion has been declared. Importantly, the narrative does not suggest that understanding the story automatically produces alignment. Knowledge has never been sufficient on its own. Throughout history, those with the most information were often those who resisted change most strongly. The story emphasizes response over awareness. Alignment is lived, not merely acknowledged. The Bible's final posture toward the listener is therefore neither threat nor persuasion. It is declaration. This is what has been done. This is how history ends. This is what remains. The response is not demanded in urgency, but invited in clarity. The story does not rush its hearer. It presents the facts and allows them to stand. As this narrative closes, it is worth noting what the Bible does not do. It does not glorify human achievement. It does not minimize human failure. It does not frame restoration as escape from responsibility. It presents completion as fulfillment of purpose that was present from the beginning. Creation was intentional. Restoration is intentional. Nothing in between was wasted. This perspective explains why the Bible has endured across cultures, eras, and systems of power. It addresses conditions that repeat across time: autonomy, fear, ambition, failure, endurance, hope. Its relevance is not dependent on circumstance. It is anchored in the explanation it provides for why those circumstances exist at all. With that, the story ends. Not with speculation, not with instruction, but with completion. What began in creation ends in restoration. What fractured through disobedience is resolved through alignment. What history exposed is answered fully. Thank you for staying through this complete journey. If this long, factual storytelling helped you understand the Bible as a single continuous story, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps this kind of content continue and reach others who are looking for the same clarity. And before you go, I'd like to ask you one specific question in the comments. Did you listen to this mainly to learn or to rest? And what time is it where you're listening from right now? This is the end of the story.